Ladies and gentlemen, this is Mihail Nansu, the voice of freedom in Eastern Europe. I'm very privileged to have a special guest today with us, and that's Douglas Murray, a very important journalist who authored many books, one of them being translated into Romanian as well, The Strange Death of Europe, Immigration, Identity and Islam. Welcome, Mr. Murray. Welcome, Douglas.
It's a great pleasure to be with you, Mihail.
You visited Transylvania. I wish we could have met face to face, but you know, thankfully.
Next time, I hope, whenever we're allowed out of our houses and allowed even to go to each other's countries, we'll do that.
So the internet seems to be helpful in building these networks of conservatives across Europe. And I was thinking to ask you several questions related to your intellectual formation, if I may put it this way. I've personally met one of your mentors, and that's the late Roger Scruton. Sir Roger Scruton. He visited Romania many times. Obviously, he visited Eastern Europe before 1989. And perhaps we could begin by asking a very simple question. What was the landmarking event, the historic event, which really shaped your understanding of the world when you were very young, say in your teens years?
Well, I wasn't especially political in my teenage years. I became interested in the wider world by the time I was at Oxford. And I remember in my second or third year, a fellow undergraduate at Oxford saying how strange it was that I always got the newspaper every day, because usually in Oxford, if you got a newspaper, it was a sign that it was the end of term and you needed to find out what had been happening outside of Oxford. I probably didn't become intensely political and indeed really work out what my own politics were until I would have said the year after I left university, which was 2001, or the year I left university actually, but the summer after I left university and the 9/11 attacks in New York and Washington. And long ago as that now seems, for me it was a clarifying event, not just because of the events themselves, but perhaps even more so because of the responses to them. So it was always my view that having traveled to America, knowing a lot of Americans, and indeed researched my first book, which was already out by then, In America a lot, I was very disturbed by the people who took the sort of America had it coming, or what can we do to stop this sort of thing happening? What have we done to make it happen? And all that sort of thing. I was just very struck at that point by the fact that for me, those weren't the primary questions. And I didn't doubt that America had flaws. I didn't doubt that the West had flaws. The democratic system had flaws. And I didn't doubt that we could improve things about ourselves. But as the late Jean Kirkpatrick once said, in order to improve ourselves, we had to be able to survive. And many of the people, the critics of America, the sort of had it coming brigade that really did divide my generation at that point, many of them really didn't seem to want the West to survive. They didn't seem to like democracy very much. They didn't like the liberal state in the proper understanding of the term. And I thought it was an enormously clarifying event. As it happened, other things were happening globally around the same time. The Second Intifada, which again, there's a certain type of radical on the left in the West, who just couldn't help making excuses for suicide bombers going into pizzerias in Tel Aviv and blowing up. You know, those people also on that issue, that also clarified. So I just said that was the time that I really started to become engaged in political thought and to intuit that I was certainly on the conservative side. And of course, if I can say so, it's a long answer to a short question, but
Go on.
I think there's something that's quite interesting to be said about this, which is that leftists are often indoctrinated into their point of view, whereas conservatives stumble into the realization that that's what they are. If you'd have said to me, well, you're obviously a conservative, when I was at university, I'd have thought, I don't think I am. But it's only when you realize that actually you do want to conserve what you think is good in your culture, that you do want to conserve the things that you put faith and trust in and believe are imbued with meaning. Now, it's only when those things that sort of come under even quite distant or remote threat that you work out sometimes, well, no, these are things I would like to conserve. And so that was how it happened for me.
As Hegel put it once, you need the negative event or experience so that you clarify who you are. You wouldn't believe this, but I wrote a book in Romanian called 7 Years in the West. And it's called, the subtitle, it's a British diary. The first page is about 9/11.
Oh, how interesting.
So we are of similar age. And this was also a foundational event for me, and I assume for our entire generation. That made you also culpable for siding with the neocons. And I was wondering, just as a small parenthesis, whether in the light of the new sort of triumph of the populist Trump movement, which is against the neocons, do you regret siding with the neocons?
I did more than side. I sort of threw myself in with both feet. Well, that's a very interesting question. It's not something I've actually been asked much about, but I'm very glad you do. My book on neoconservatism is the only book of mine that I don't allow to be reprinted, because if I did a new edition, it would have to be very different, and I don't want to have to rewrite a book. I'm proud of what I wrote about the intellectual history of neoconservatism, which I think then and think still has been very grossly misrepresented. And it's a very interesting tradition.
Irving Kristol, people like that.
Irving Kristol, Norman Podhoretz, Daniel Bell, very remarkable people. Daniel Patrick Moynihan.
Yes.
It was a very interesting group, and I was thrilled, fascinated to be, when I was sort of doing the archaeology on and putting down what it was that had become known as neoconservatism. And I was very proud after it came out, when I think it was Erwin Stelzer, who actually edited a book of essays on neoconservatism, who said to me that it wasn't until he'd read my book that he'd actually understood Leo Strauss. And I was very proud of that, because Strauss is a very complex thinker to write about. And I think I mastered it at the time, albeit now some of it, as often happens, is filtered away. But to get to the difficult bit of your question, when I look back now, I think that neoconservatism and the rather strident attitude I took at the time in the 2000s was appealing to me because it was the most direct, clear, and intellectually backed up way in which to oppose the people I saw as opponents. And the critique that neoconservatives had of moral relativism was very striking to me. I thought that conservatism, in certainly my own country, was deeply lost. And when I look back now, I think I did make a number of mistakes, errors that I slipped into. And I think the most serious, the one that I wish I had been able to think about more clearly then, but I can see better now, was slipping into that mistake that I suppose you could say Fukuyama had slipped into as well, which is some people attribute to a misreading of, well, Kojève's misreading of Hegel, and specifically the issue of whether or not you can effectively speed up history. And this is something which, in the context of the Middle East, and I think now we can see pretty much failed interventions there, maybe learned the hard way, not as hard as the people in those countries, but it was certainly, I think I was certainly over-optimistic about some of that. So yes, I mean, that's something I think about differently now.
And not alone. I mean, even somebody like a towering figure like William F. Buckley sided with the invasion of Iraq. He thought that nation building could happen in the Middle East. Mm-hmm. And for a Brit, you know, you had an empire and you had very successful stories written in Hong Kong, in other parts of the world. Perhaps it was a legitimate sort of hope, but still very costly. And that's Trump's critique against the neocons, right?
Yes, it was very, sorry, something flying around here. That's right. I mean, I think I don't know if Trump's critique is particularly sort of philosophically worked out. I think it's an instinctive thing that the Conservatives, the Republicans in power in America ran up a very, very large check on these interventions, and there was a lot of blood as well as treasure spilled. That's what I think Trump particularly objects to, is just the idea of throwing American gold and lives away on what he sees as being a futile exercise. I think that the history books will show on that particular issue. I think the history books will take a long time to recognize that the intent behind that war, in particular the Second Iraq War, was good. That it was not malevolent. It was not. It wasn't done for the oil or anything like that. If it had have been, it would have been a very different story. I think that it's going to take a long time for people to accept that the intention was good, and it really was to not to just bring about regime change, but change the nature of societies, and hopefully, in the good sense, liberalize and certainly democratize societies in the Middle East. I think that has been not a complete failure, but it's certainly not been a success. And I think, in part, if I were to say or give a reason for that, the main reason is, and I didn't realize this at the time, I certainly realize it now, that America as a state, as you mentioned, is not like the UK in history, in that America clearly does not produce the sort of person who wants to go around the world to other countries and stay in them for a very long time. America, it's
is large enough to.
It seeks to go in and, sorry, what was that?
America is large enough to take care of itself.
Yes, and it doesn't. When it goes elsewhere, it wants to know how fast it can get out, which is very different, as you say, from the British imperial past. Not that I ever thought that this was an imperial project. With America, I just thought that that it had more of a class of person who would be able to do the things that were needed to stay the long course. But I mean, as I say, I mean, I think it's not without success. I mean, we've had 20 yees, almost 20 years now in Afghanistan, which is an unbelievable period when you think about it. But that isn't totally without success. The Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups haven't been able to launch attacks on the West since then from there. And that's not a small thing. But there's no way that we're making Afghanistan a liberal democracy, and I accept that.
Another critique that comes from Trump's camp is that we got carried away with the story related to the Middle East, partly because of the British perhaps past, but we forgot completely about China. It's not you that forgot about China. You wrote about it. You critiqued David Cameron for embracing the Chinese Communist Party perhaps too closely. However, do you have this sense of like, do you feel like we forgot a very important topic? That's China.
I don't know that we forgot it. It's a good question, because there is certainly now a feeling that we were distracted onto other things. That's not without cause, of course. I mean, there were good reasons to be distracted in the Middle East after 9/11. I do think that the deeper tectonic shift of our time was always coming from China. It was always a US-China hegemony issue. I think my own critique of the British government, and indeed the Australian government in the past, among others, was that we always knew the price in our relations with China. We knew that there was a very attractive bauble, much more than a bauble, whole bags of baubles to be gained in our societies by close trade links in particular. But we also always knew that there was a price tag attached, that there were things that you could say that that's the case with all trade to some extent, and all investment to some extent, and to some extent that is true. However, China always had more things attached than I think we admitted to ourselves. And that's because, I mean, for the Cameron government, it was because in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, we were in a the difficult position of needing to encourage outside investment and needing to try to boom, basically. And so I suppose the Cameron government's view was, you can't be too choosy. And if that means that, you ditch the Dalai Lama, well, so be it. And if it means that you do more and more supine things in your foreign policy, then so be it. I think that has been exposed in Britain, as it was in an earlier period in Australia, as having been a long-term strategic mistake in order to accomplish a short-term economic goal. I think that people knew that at the time. They just, I think, hoped that the long-term issue would not come on their term.
When in fact, we can see right now in Hong Kong, thousands of young protesters singing the national anthem of the United States and being savaged, destroyed by the Chinese Communist police. But let's come back to the intellectual story. Huntington was rather famous and very much read in those days. Samuel Huntington.
Absolutely.
And
I read him avidly. Most people who talk about him, as you know, haven't read him. It's extraordinary. I've never known an intellectual, even including Fukuyama, be so widely critiqued. This is certainly the case with Huntington. Be so widely critiqued by people who have never read a word of his.
We, the Christian Orthodox, read him because we felt expelled from the famous club of the Westerners. He said that Russia and Romania and perhaps Greece would belong to an Orthodox civilization quite different from the Protestant and Catholic West. And that was a big intellectual debate in Romania in the late 90s, I think. But do you think he was vindicated? I mean, his view on China and Islam, in a general sense, was vindicated.
It's a very interesting. In some ways, I think I think that Huntington's two most significant books, Clash of Civilizations and Who Are We, which I also read avidly when it came out, are both profoundly important books. The first, obviously, because it looks at the wider world, and the second, because it looks at the deep question of what America is, what it ought to be, what it is comprised of. And these were both very, very difficult questions. Now, they're made more difficult, both of them, by one similar problem, which is, you could say, a problem of our time, perhaps a problem always, which is this. There are questions domestically and abroad, which it sometimes seems to me we cannot answer because we've already ruled out certain things. What I mean is there is a type of problem which we cannot solve because we know already in advance what the answers cannot be. Now, domestically, and in the case of Who Are We, I should say, it slightly comes out like the Chinese technology.
Company,
Are we?
I'm afraid the answer to the question, who are we, will be who are we?
Yes, exactly. I'm going to steal that.
And what's the next intifada? It's the antifada, yes. Please kill them, kindly. We're intellectual theft, don't we? I'm joking.
The second antifada. Yes, I think that in the domestic realm, it's quite straightforward that you have to, in America, Western Europe, you have to say, who are we? You have to say we are a multicultural society which owes our existence to a huge range of sources. That's what you have to say. Now, it's not entirely true. In fact, it's a bit of a lie. Quite a bit of a lie in some circumstances, but that's the only sort of acceptable one. You can't come back with saying, well, we're a white Protestant majority country. You're not allowed to do that, and certainly in modern America. Certainly when Huntington was writing Who Are We? Clash of Civilizations is similar. The reason why the furore happened over that book, the essay and then the book, was because people recognized that he had put his finger on the thing that you were not meant to put your finger on. And that's why I'm very interested in political figures who do this, because it's very interesting, isn't it? Of all the political scientists, theorists, and sometimes practitioners in politics, some become infamous And it's not because they've said things that are totally untrue. It's because they've touched one of the things that we know is at least true in part, but troubles us too much. So we have to anathematize and scapegoat often the person who's dared to do it. I think in British politics, it's clearly the fact that that was the case with, say, Enoch Powell. He wasn't entirely right by any means in his analysis of immigration in the 60s onwards, but we know that he was onto something, and that's why it's so painful whenever his name comes up. And I think it's the same with Huntington. Huntington identified this unsayable issue, which was that the civilizations are different and that they grind against each other in places. And of course, famously in his case, identified the fact that the borders of Islam are especially bloody and grind against all the civilizations with which they come into contact. Now, as I say, this is why Samuel Huntington retains the potency and the stigma that he still does. I think he was at least considerably right in his analysis. I think he's been proven to be so. And I think I just add one other thing, which is, of course, that on the domestic and on the international front, the thing that has been so hard for Western European and American mankind to deal with in recent years is the recognition that our own state of affairs is not the natural starting point of human affairs. And this has been very hard to accept, because the presumption had been that in the liberal era. And people have tried to hold on to it very, very, very hard, and didn't want to give it up. And I can understand that. But Huntington was one of those figures who came along and to a great extent spoiled the party.
He wanted a kind of resurrection of the WASP spirit in America. He wanted to see more people proud of themselves when they speak about individual rights, when they speak about property, hard work ethic, and so on. Mm. But it seems that now this camp, and that's Trump's base, is under a very savage attack. I was reminded of this when I got this quote from the autobiography of Richard Dawkins, who wrote about him, and he said, "I live in a post-Christian world in Oxford. It is extremely civilized." You wouldn't say that about Washington, D.C. these days, or Los Angeles, or Austin, Texas, or even London. Very uncivilized people started to attack the very foundational values of the West. How do you explain it?
Yes. Well, there's lots of things in that. One is the nature of increasingly diverse societies. There's no way around this. It's exceedingly politically incorrect, certainly from the country I'm from, to say this, but it is simply the case that if you import the world's people, you import the world's problems, as I think I said somewhere in The Strange Death of Europe. It's the downside of it. There are upsides of immigration, but there are downsides, and that's one of the biggest. Now, the presumption in the multicultural era was that everybody became like us. And it seems not to be the case. We have to adapt to the people who come in as much, at least, as they want to adapt or need to adapt to us, the hosts. So that is a source of considerable pain. In America, it's slightly different, of course, because this issue has been there from the start. You can argue that America is a nation of immigrants. It's not an argument that any serious person can make about Britain, for instance. And I think that so that's one part of the issue, is the demographic change, which leads to I think an increasingly chaotic public square, where people assert anything, and you feel you don't have the right to assert the values of the host society. Which is, of course, a historic error, because there's a reason why people want to come to such societies and why they don't wish to, migrate to the Sudan, for instance. There must be something right about your country, something good about your country, if people want to come to it. The second thing, though, is that very interesting, which you know well, the interesting question of chicken and egg between the issue of migration and the issue of the post-intelligentsia, academia, politics, and others basically losing faith in, or indeed turning against, their own story. This is what Roger Scruton famously summed up as the culture of self-abnegation, where you turn on everything that is yours.
You repudiate.
You repudiate. Sorry, yes, of course, it's a culture of repudiation. Sorry, not self-abnegation. The culture of repudiation, and that is something that all my life I've seen around me. The last thing, I mean, this is a long-running thing. This is one of the reasons why it's very interesting. I mean, George Orwell, 70 or 80 years ago now, 80 years ago, identified that, you know, the least likely thing a British intellectual would do would be to stand when the national anthem was played. But this has certainly, by our own day, developed into something else, and it's something like a cultural masochism, in my view. The nicest interpretation of why that happens is that people, a certain type of liberal, believes, as I said earlier, that the natural state of things is the state that they are in, and that things will always go on like that. And so why not allow, you know, all sorts of things to go on in your society, all sorts of repudiations of it, and that you'll survive it. As a somewhat pessimistic view on that, not by nature, but simply by observation, I would say those people are wildly wrong. I think they have very little understanding of history, or the fact that history can happen to them. And history is happening to us now, of course, as we speak. We've been, I think yesterday in Oxford, there was an attempt to pull down a statue in Oxford from one of the colleges. Yesterday in London, a statue was removed by the Museum of London because the person on the plinth had benefited from the slave trade. And we're going through an interesting period where one can understand those periods where the pagans attacked, and where the Vandals attacked, and where the iconoclasts pulled down the statuary and icons that did not appeal to their particular interpretation of faith. And we also see, of course, this extraordinary sight of a new faith. It'll be unsuccessful, and it'll be bloody and a mess, but an attempt to create a sort of new faith is going on as we speak. The extraordinary sight of leading members of the Democratic Party like Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi kneeling down, taking the knee, as they now call it, as if this is an agreed upon, well-recognized ancient custom in our society, which it isn't at all. I think it's a little bit of an amalgamation of Game of Thrones into the popular culture or something. And Nancy Pelosi, and then they wear what they see as being native gear, and these things, and kneeling for 9 minutes or 8 minutes, and these are strange on the run attempts to embed some kind of metaphysical system into a rather lost system.
Well, since you have another friend who is a great historian, Niall Ferguson, and he wrote that interesting book about civilization, talking about apps. I once asked him, you know, I understand which the apps are, like science, hard work ethic, you know, property rights. But what's the operating system? Like what's the equivalent of the iOS, as it were, in terms of civilization? And if there's anything like this, like first you have the operating system and then you download the apps, it seems that it's precisely the operating system that's under attack, not just one app or another app.
Well, this brings us, that's a very, very good question. I think he's answered it elsewhere. I don't know if he did to you, but he did once tell me, I think he said it publicly, Neil said that he had spoken to somebody, a leading figure in China, who described themselves as having studied Western civilization to try to work out why it had worked so well. Said, you know, we looked at your economics and we didn't think that was, you know, we thought that wasn't necessarily the complete answer to the question of how the West had thrived. We looked at your, you know, listed a whole set of things, and then said, but then we looked at your religion and realized that
Christianity,
that was where it had come from. Now that's, I think I'm horribly mauling this story, which was much better told by Neil, but I think I've got the gist of it there. That comes down to what I've identified in the past as being really one of the most painful and difficult, personally and societally, questions of our time. What this question throws up, if indeed it's true, and I think that it, to a very considerable extent, is, if that is true, then we find ourselves in a very difficult position, because the thing that brought us here is something that we do not seem to any longer be able to believe. Now, I happen to find myself in that category, and it's a very difficult and painful conundrum for me, and one that I've written about at some length. I think that the conundrum is for the various reasons I lay out in at least one chapter in A Strange Death of Europe, modern European man finds it hard to believe, and the reasons are pretty compelling. It's not through laziness alone or lack of will, certainly not for everyone. But we do, once you make the leap, and by the way, the conclusion that religion might be at the source of some of the things we enjoy is also one of those questions which for many people is cut off. That is an answer you cannot come to. If it is the case, then we find ourselves in this very difficult position, which is we enjoy living in the heat of the fire, but cannot tend the fire. We like living in the afterglow, but cannot keep the thing burning. This is, I think, one of the causes of what I've identified as the tiredness that exists in modern European thought, as well as in modern European events, that there is a fatalism caused by an awareness of this conundrum. An awareness that is most clearly felt in the fact that we have churches in every village, every town, every few streets, and we don't know what they're for, what to do with them, or what our attitude should be to them, or even what to do with them.
I came to England in order to study Christian theology. I remember going to Sinai, to Mount Sinai. Maybe you know the story that Moses wasn't just stuttering, he was also deaf. And when God gave him the 10 Commandments, he said, now take your people and bring them to Transylvania. Since he was deaf, he heard Transjordania, hence all the problems. Now, apart from the joke, I have to say that I went to Mount Sinai in order to see the Mount of Moses and the monastery built by Justinian. And Sinai is also, there's a monastery there which had some Romanian monks. Anyway, the long story short goes like this. I brought back from Sinai to London, King's College London, right there on Strand, opposite Bush House, and I brought back an icon of Jesus Christ in the Department of Theology. And I was studying theology like all my colleagues, Christian theology. And I was told we cannot hang the picture of Christ because we might offend some Muslims who would also study religious studies. And so I realized in 2003, that was a very, very sort of shocking moment for me, that the West doesn't know the value of Christianity in the way we in Eastern Europe experience that value. And I personally experienced this through people that survived the communist prison. Somehow they found God in prayer during those horrific years of Stalinism in the 50s.
Yes.
And so I belong to that generation that took it for granted when people told us that they received grace in prison, that they met God in prison in prayer. I took it for granted. I never questioned it, so to speak.
Yes. Well, that's you touch on, of course, a very important issue in the history of Christianity, as well as the issue of your country. I mean, this has always been the case historically, hasn't it? That, I mean, Christianity thrives when oppressed. It burns brightest when there's an attempt to snuff it out. I think the history of Christianity in Eastern and Central Europe in the late 20th century is a profoundly important history and a very profoundly important part of the Christian story. And a reminder, I mean, I know that there are a number of people who've been writing about this recently. I think Rod Dreher has just finished a book. I saw him at a conference in Rome recently. I think he's written a book recently just about to come out about aspects of this and what he learned from the Eastern and Central European countries that had suffered under communism, and yet in which the flame of Christianity had been shining, burning bright. It is a complex question. Why this is the case. Obviously, practicing Christians, believing Christians have their own explanations for it. My own settlement, by the way, such as it is about these matters, is that people should remain in dialogue and in communion, to use a somewhat suggestive term, with the faith, precisely in order to be open for such an experience, should it come. I think there's nothing worse in a way than completely closing yourself off to it in the manner that some more strident atheists, including Richard Dawkins, do, albeit he has done it for his own very sincere reasons. And but I think that in general, I think it should be regarded as being the attitude of a non-believer to, as I say, remain in dialogue. I think this was an invitation that Cardinal Ratzinger, when he was Cardinal Ratzinger, I always still think of him as such. One invitation he made, I think he made it in a conversation with Jürgen Habermas, the dialectics of secularization, if I remember rightly.
Yes.
Anyhow, I think it was in that conversation that Ratzinger said this as well, that religion and philosophy should be in dialogue, and they must be in dialogue.
As they were at the beginning of our, Western sort of story. And I mean, since you've mentioned this, I wanted to ask you another question, because you got very close to Jordan Peterson recently. I mean, that is in the last 3 or 4 days. And he's very fond of Eastern European writers like Solzhenitsyn and like Dostoevsky. He always talks about these people. What did you what did you get from him? From Jordan?
I don't particularly like to think of it in that term of what I get.
Like intellectually,
yes,
it opens up new horizons.
Yeah. Well, Jordan's a very remarkable thinker and a very compelling figure, a very, very, very important figure. He brought an enormous number of people to ideas, issues, books, and invited them to live their lives more meaningfully in a way that is obviously deeply, deeply unusual. I've done a number of events with Jordan. I've got to know him in recent years, and he's an extraordinary person, and I can think of no intellectual in my lifetime who has been able to draw the kinds of crowds he has. And for all of his critics, they never contend with just that one question, which was, you see, if I found this the other way around, if I found that a thinker of the left or any thinker, let's say somebody I was just in disagreement with, was filling up halls night after night of thousands of young people, I believe I would try to work out what it was that was going on, because I would know that this must be, I may disagree with it, but there must be something that is being spoken to here. And I was just always amazed with Jordan when he was touring, that just the critics never contended with that. And I think that to understand him, you have to start from that. What is it that he provided and provides, and I hope will continue to provide in the future? What is it that draws people? And I think it is an invitation to take your life seriously, to live your life more meaningfully. And I think that for a lot of young people, men and women, you could say men in particular, again, his critics usually do, but that's not quite fair. I've known from audiences, it's both sexes are drawn to this, but they are thrown out into the world with no explanation for what they should be doing. And we've seen the exacerbation of something that one of my great intellectual heroes, Alan Bloom, wrote about 35 years ago now, in The Closing of the American Mind, that we find ourselves in this position where as Bloom said, young people know what the perfect body is, but they don't know what the perfect soul or perfect mind would be. No, they don't have a conception of it, other than this very unpleasant retributive lifestyle that is offered to them by the sort of social justice activists who will ruin their lives and make them be very unpleasant and unhappy people. So I think that Jordan took seriously the questions, the deep questions that young people in particular are asking, but people of all ages are asking, and which the culture is almost entirely silent on. Even the churches are almost entirely silent on it, certainly in my own country. So I would say that I would just add one other thing, which is that you mentioned Jordan's affection for Dostoevsky and Solzhenitsyn, something I share very much. I think there's a reason for that. I mean, the same reason I've in this lockdown period, I've been reading all of Tolstoy that I haven't read before, which has been the one real blessing of the Corona era for me. And in recent years, I also read Vasily Grossman and others, and have found it deeply affecting me. Previously, the Russian writer I was most fond of was Turgenev, but I've been thinking quite a lot of why these writers, particularly Russian writers, should be so dominant for some of us. And I think it is at the root. It is that simple reason that the East, for want of a better term, has gone through absolutely everything in a way that Western Europe long ago forgot, and that it's quite easy to write a very bad novel in Britain about your generation, let's say, sort of a story of, I don't know, divorce and remarriage. Yeah. If you write a novel about Russia in the 20th century, indeed Russia in the 19th century, it's quite hard to screw up, because you're writing about everything. I mean, you're writing about a society which just blow upon blow can happen to, as you know, from Romania, and yet people have to find a way, and the human spirit finds a way to carry on. And that is just simply, from an outsider point of view, much more interesting. And in the case of the great writers I referred to, inevitably throws up answers to deeper questions. It's just inevitable that in the hands of a great writer like Solzhenitsyn, I mean, I think any writer almost could, if they'd gone through that, have given us things of great value. But if on top of that it's somebody with the moral insight and the eye for the detail, and that crucial thing, the sense of, is there anything to take away from this and pass on as in the hope that it might become stored knowledge, that's just one reason, I think, but I
would be very interested one day, perhaps not today, because our time is going up, but one day perhaps you could develop more this theme, this topic, what is the mob? Because Dostoevsky very much talks about the power of the collective in the Demons, essay, The Possessed, I mean, this novel from 1870. Yeah. And there's something very special that happens with us, the individuals, when we become part and parcel of a collective crowd, the mob, as you put it. There's also the Twitter mob and the anti-social media mob.
Yes.
But there's something happening to us. And, one of the last questions I wanted to ask you is, what does it take to be an individual, to be a human person, to be who you are, not who your ancestors were necessarily, or maybe who your fellow travelers are, to be yourself,
Yes. Well, in my own view, you can't divorce yourself entirely from what you come from. And unless you come from a very unpleasant place, either domestically or indeed societally, you should start by where you come from. That it's, I mean, I can't help saying those words without thinking of the words of Eliot in the Four Quartets. Home is where we start from. And so I would say that it's, in order to live the possibility of a contented life, or meaningful or happy life, it must at some level include making peace with home, with where you come from, at least making peace with it, if not more, best of all to be able to build on it and improve it. But then beyond then, there is, of course, the creation of the self. I think that, well, this is an enormously complex area. My own view is, first of all, on standing out from crowds. I've written about this in my latest book, as you know, in The Madness of Crowds. Yes. And this is a subject which is more and more pertinent day by day. Some people have the instinct and some people do not. But I think the instinct is learned. And I'll tell you where it comes from. The ability to stand against the mob comes not by through your mother's milk. It comes in the realization that what the mob has to offer is something you do not wish to have. That it cannot give you anything that you don't have. It can take away things from you that you do have, including reason, including a sense of justice.
Self-restraint.
Restraint, an awful lot of things. I mean, another example, actually, as well as the demons, is that moment, the great nightmare dream in Crime and Punishment, of the flogging of the animal by the mob. You know, when people subsume themselves into a crowd, the attraction of it is they lose their sense of self, and the danger is that they lose their sense of self. And these pulls, these twin pulls, are in all of us.
Apollo and Dionysius, as Nietzsche put it, right?
Exactly.
In the birth of tragedy, he says that there are these two forces, the force of reason and then the Dionysian aspect.
And the Dionysian aspect is there. Every single human being has a part of ourselves at a time when that is something that appeals to us. It's why there were Roman festivals, to get that out of the system on pre-prescribed days. I think that in our own time, it's there are senses in which we dissolve into the crowd, which can be good, as historically. I think in the collective, the we, as Roger often wrote about, of the collective of the nation, and other forms of plural membership. I think, however, that it is certainly, my own country is dominated at the moment by a very sinister urge, and the sinister urge is the desire to find heretics, hound them out, get rid of the plurality of thought. And this is what troubles me most about my own country today. I've actually just written today the cover piece for this week's Spectator on events in my own country and America and elsewhere. And what troubles me about the mob, I've never, I quite enjoy not being part of the crowd. I always have done. I don't like crowds. I actually have always had a visceral dislike of them. I don't even like going to football matches and things because of them. I just don't like the way they behave. And I'm not saying they can't be good. They've never particularly been for me. And I'm also never happier than when I'm walking against the crowd. And I don't know where that comes from, but if somebody says there's something you can't say, I'm immediately attracted to saying it. But I am very worried at the extraordinary number of people in my own society who have entirely lost the ability even to recognize that contrary points of view are legitimate or needing to be heard. And I see in this the dissolving, the disappearance, you might say, of the genuinely liberal mind, and the resurgence of a type of illiberalism in the true sense, which is deeply troubling, because what we call now the woke mind, which is to flatter it, of course, to call it a mind, but the woke mind does not act as the truly liberal mind does. You know, the truly liberal mind is open to ideas. The woke mind is totally closed to them because it believes it knows the answers. The liberal mind is capable of humility, and the woke mind is not. The liberal mind is open, the woke mind is closed. The liberal mind is aware that it can be wrong, and the woke mind couldn't believe such a polity could occur. So this to me is why I don't like mobs at the moment. And I suppose I'll just say one other thing on that, which is that, of course, as a conservative, there is an instinctive fear of mob behavior because we know where it goes. And in recent days, when I've seen crowds pulling down statues in my own country and jumping up and down on them like a demented mob in the Middle East after a revolution of some kind, pulling down the statue of a tyrant who has always oppressed them, with them doing this with historical figures who none of them have suffered from, I do have the same instinct and fear that Edmund Burke had at the French Revolution. I see a mob going wild. I worry because I know where it goes. I know where it can go. And I know that at such moments, people become high on the octane of the moment and end up pulling down the things that are holding them up. So, yes, that's, I could go on all day about these.
I think it's the fundamental question. There's a book written by a secular historian, maybe you read it, Inventing the Individual by Larry
Siedentop. He's a friend of mine, yes.
That's an amazing book.
It's a very important book. I'm
And
so pleased you say that. I shall tell him. He's a wonderful thinker, a wonderful writer. And yes, Inventing the Individual is a very important book.
There's another person I never met called Maurice Cowling, and I wish I could have met him. He was a great historian in Cambridge. But so he gets the point. He gets the contribution of Christian theology, that's even Pauline theology, very well. But the very sort of basic point I would make is that every fundamental experience is personal. You fall in love on a personal level. You cherish a friendship in personal relational terms.
Yes.
You think deeply only when you're alone. You have faith and you talk to God, if you do, only person to person. That's at least what Kierkegaard or other great theologians would say. So what the mobs does, it takes from you everything that is empowering and dignifying about the individual. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I do. And I think there's a reason we haven't touched on, there's a subject for another day perhaps, which is the extent to which the modern world sets us up for this fall, in that we are invited to spend ever less time alone, even when we are alone, looking into our devices, as Eliot says somewhere, distracted from distraction by distraction.
We become the insects of the hour, he also said.
Yes, exactly. And I think to a great extent, the great challenge for all of us in our time is the challenge that Schiller puts somewhere. He says somewhere that the desire should be one should seek to be a part of your century, but do not be its creature. And I've always found this quote enormously moving. It doesn't feel right to zone out of your time. You should be involved in your time, but you shouldn't be its creature. And the iPhone in particular, for its wonder, it should not be our master. And we can do amazing things with it. And I've often thought about this in recent weeks, in the weeks of isolation, that it takes isolation to remind oneself of the good sides of some technology like this. I love the fact that Spotify on my phone can bring a far larger range of music to my ears than I have in my CD collection or anywhere else. It's not got everything in it, but as I often find out, but it's got an awful lot. And if one could remember those bits of the blessing of technology and a bit less of the encouragement to join a herd and stampede or distract oneself endlessly, then one can find the correct relationship between us and the devices which dominate our lives.
As William F. Buckley said, life cannot be so horrible when for $10 you can have access to all of Bach's cantatas.
Yes, exactly.
So let's complain less and enjoy more the gifts we are given. Another author, and this is the last comment I'll make, that talks about the force of the mob, the demonic possession of the mob, the ideological possession, if you want, is René Girard, and he describes the moment when Jesus was rejected by the mob and Barabbas was selected to be set free. Barabbas, by the way, etymologically means the son of the father.
Yes.
So the mob should not be trusted. And in the 50s and in the 60s, all the Polish, Czech, Romanian intellectuals were put on trial and sent to prison by the mob. They were treated very unfairly. So perhaps history should teach us that no human life should be sentenced to death only because the crowds say so.
We have the most powerful example of that in the Christian religious tradition. I first encountered Girard thanks to Roger Scruton, who was a great admirer of his and was persuaded, as he was, of the truthfulness of particularly what Girard writes about in Violence and the Sacred. I think it's an enormously important thing, and the mimetic idea is in particular. And I wish it were better known, because once you encounter it, you understand an awful lot of what's going on around us today. And of course, that's the other thing about reading these great writers, is that it means that when you contend with them, you return to the world better able to understand what in it you can impact and do something about and what you cannot.
Well, Douglas, I'm very grateful for this conversation, an hour-long conversation. And I do hope that, 10 years from now, we will see a stronger network of conservative intellectuals in this, making this transatlantic alliance more powerful. Because in a way, it was this alliance between John Paul II and Ronald Reagan that brought to an end communism. And perhaps it's the task of our generation to expose the lies of communist China, the errors of political Islam, the faults of political correctness, and rebuild the West with renewed forces.
If I can say so, I completely agree. And I would just say that it's for some time been my view that the Eastern European countries in particular have a very, very important role to play there, because people of our age, and we're not that old, people who are, and some who are slightly younger than us, have the story that Americans and Western Europeans have forgotten. And for a young person in the West to know that their contemporaries experience the system they are trying to reenact seems to me to be the most profound challenge to them that we could have. And that's why I just urge all of our friends in your part of our continent of the importance of speaking and knowing that you have to get your voices out as widely as possible, because it is especially crucial in this generation.
Do you have any plans in terms of literary plans, future books?
Well, my diary doesn't have anything in it for the rest of my life. It's a clear run from now till the grave.
Perfect answer. Thank you very much, Douglas. This was a
great pleasure.
Conversation, and I wish you well. All the best.
To you.
Bye.
Bye.